Hi everybody, welcome to the FedRAMP Online Training Series. I'm Jason Oxenhandler, your instructor for this training. If my voice sounds vaguely familiar to you, it's because I've been doing all the other trainings you've taken up to this point. So in this course, we are going to talk about the question that we always hear about as FedRAMP ISSOs, and that is how to write a control. The FedRAMP PMO is developing this training to help you properly prepare for a FedRAMP assessment by providing a detailed understanding of the program and really the level of effort required to complete a FedRAMP assessment. So we're going to go at your pace. You can rewind us, you can move us back and forth, whatever it is you need to do, so that this training module will help you document security of your cloud system and will also help you with writing controls that are compliant, that have compliant implementation descriptions in your SSP or your system security plan. So the thought process behind this is that if we provide insight into what you really should expect while going through a FedRAMP assessment, then we make sure you have the knowledge and resources that you need to successfully achieve FedRAMP authorization. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we want to do is review some specific tips for writing the SSP. Now, the great thing about this is these tips aren't just for the SSP. These can be applied to the contingency plan, the configuration management plan, the IRP, all those good documents. You can take these principles and apply them. So, at the conclusion of this training, you should be able to understand the following. The document acceptance criteria. Basically, what are we looking for in your documents that make them acceptable for FedRAMP submission? Also, keep in mind the technical acceptance criteria. That's just as crucial as the document acceptance criteria. And lastly, the difference between a good control implementation statement and, well, a not so good implementation statement. All right, so let's talk about writing a FedRAMP SSP. A lot of times we hear FedRAMP is not your average FSMA. This is FSMA on steroids, if you will. There's quite a bit of a change in mindset that you need when you're actually writing this documentation. So first thing you want to do is make sure you allocate sufficient time, effort, and resources for writing. And it's not just the SSP. As I mentioned a few slides ago, you're going to need a couple of people on your team to do this. This is not a one-person show. So you want to make sure that you have enough time, you have enough human resources to be able to get not just the SSP done, but you want to also get those appendices, your CIS document, the Control Implementation Summary document, the contingency plan, the configuration management plan. This is really a team effort because not only do you need people to prepare the documentation, you also need to schedule time to talk with folks who are SMEs in their respected areas. So you'll want to talk to people who are your contingency plan SMEs, your incident response team, maybe a NOC or a SOC team, depending upon how your platform is structured. So keep in mind it's not just a one-person show, but rather you need to get all of your team members on board to help put the little pieces of the FedRAMP puzzle together. All right, so now you want to strongly and clearly articulate your security architecture and your implementations. So that's a couple of different things you need to think about there. As you know, the flow of an SSP generally starts with general information, contact information, security, categorization, things like that. Then you gradually move down into your diagrams, your architecture diagram, network diagram, boundary diagram, data flow information, hardware, software lists, all that kind of jazz. And then you go into the implementations. So what you really need to keep in mind is that the top part of your SSP, sections 1 through 11 or 1 through 12, depending upon what version you are using and what time you've entered the FedRAMP process, you want to make sure that there is a consistent flow between your top segment and the implementation part. So in other words, for example, all of the roles and responsibilities that you put in the top section, I believe it's section 9 off the top of my head, don't quote me, but in the top section you have a roles and responsibilities matrix. Well, the people that are in that roles and responsibilities matrix, that information very well better be the same that is in your implementation section, because those are the people that when you have the system assessed, those are the people that are going to be interviewed by your assessor. So make sure your architecture, your boundary diagrams, all of the information in there is really a graphical interpretation of your implementation statement. So that's a guide to kind of help you go through from top to bottom. Tell a story. Number 3, tell a story. This is the big one. I have to say, I've been a FedRAMP ISSO for some time now, and that is what we want to see, is a story. We want to know who, what, when, where, why, and most importantly, the how. Now, if you remember back to grade school, those were the 5 W's you'd have to answer when you were doing a current events homework assignment or something like that. And how was kind of the odd man out. Well, it's a little bit different here. How is the crux of your implementation? That's what we want to know, because essentially when you go to assessment, that's what's going to be tested, is the how. You say you do this, how? Okay, we test it. The 3PAO tests it, rather. So we want all of that information. Now, it's a little different than procedures. We don't want step-by-step instructions, but we want to know how you implement Active Directory, for example. How do you create a network account? How do you create a system administrator account? And those are things you really need to be careful of, because sometimes it's very simple to get into the habit of just putting one role down, for example, a system administrator. But we want to know about your system, inclusive of system administrators, network administrators, incident response leads. You got to give us the whole picture. We need to know the whole story, because it's not just the system administrator's responsibility. It's a bunch of different roles and responsibilities. So make sure that the who is in there for where it applies. The what is the solution, and how is it implemented? So make sure if you put in something that's very high level, you can ask yourself how, and that will usually lead you into writing the rest of the controls. Now, speaking of the controls, you have to answer the whole kit and caboodle, all 100% of it. You know how they're broken out into, different letters, A, B, C, D, sometimes there's Roman numerals. What you want to make sure you do is answer every single one. And a trick to help you do that is by looking at the verbs in each assessment objective. If it says establishes and enforces blah, 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 you have got to make sure you explain establishes, how you establish whatever they're looking for, and how you enforce whatever it is you're looking for. Those are the things we want to see. Those are the things that we actually look for when we're reading the documentation. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, when we start seeing things that are supposed to be there and aren't, that's when the red flags start going off and the start waving around and the bells and whistles start going off. That's why we want to make sure you answer everything completely, concisely, and consistently throughout the entire document. So that leads me to slide number 6. Be clear, concise, consistent, and complete. If you mention your system, XYZ system, mention it as XYZ system throughout. A lot of times we see XYZ, XYZ system, XA, or whatever it is. Don't give multiple iterations of the same system. Say it once, say it throughout. That's a good way to do that. Adequately reference all of your documentation. So looking at slide number 7, make sure if you refer to a policy, a procedure, an interconnection agreement, what have you, there are millions of things you can reference. Make sure you put in the name, the date, the section, and the version of that document, so that when the assessor or the JAB has a question or the agency has a question, they can just go back to the name of the document, make sure the date is the same as is on the name, go back to the version number, and then just open the page to the section. Just as simply. It's that simple. We want to make this an easy evolution and also make it easier on yourselves. Why should you have to go thumbing through a document? You know where it is. You had to look at it in the first place. Just document it down that way and it'll be much easier. And last but not least, you want to make sure you are in compliance with FedRAMP policy. You want to make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed and that the document is polished and ready to go. All right, let's start with some basic writing tips. We want you to use the correct FedRAMP SSP template. Now, a lot of people ask the questions, well, can I change it? What can I do with it? Do not modify or remove anything. Repeat, do not modify or remove anything. However, if you have something that you feel will add to the description of your system or will help enforce something or enhance something, by all means go ahead and add it. Just do not modify or delete anything. That's all we ask of you. Okay, I mentioned this just a few moments ago. Make sure you use consistent terminology throughout the entire SSP. So if you have server A, call it server A throughout the entire SSP. Make sure it stays the same, because now if you call it, number 1 server A, well, is it the same thing or is it something entirely different? So please make sure that if you say one thing once, you say it the same throughout. We want you to make sure you reference documents properly. We mentioned that a few moments ago. Name, version, date, and section. If you really want to be nice, throw in a page number. We'll love you all the more for it. Okay, so same things go for system names and abbreviations, hardware and software elements, and also just making sure you get the document references proper. So be direct and to the point. Not like I just was 2 sentences ago, but be direct and to the point. Say what you need to say. Don't beat around the bush. Avoid run-on sentences, and do not use the passive voice. So let me give you an example. For those of you that don't remember 7th grade grammar, I barely did until I just went back and read it. So if you're talking in the passive voice, you're saying the jury was lied to by the defendant. Okay? So active voice would be the defendant lied to the jury. Okay? Concise and clear. That's all we pretty much want from you. So after all your implementations are run, at the very least, do a spell check in Microsoft Word. Now, that said, spell check will only get you so far. You really need a strong technical writer to read the document for grammar, for things like active and passive voice, and also for spelling, because you may spell a word correctly, but it might be the wrong word that's there. So be careful with that. So for example, the easiest one I could think of just right off the top of my head is two, and two, T-O, T-W-O, and T-O-O. The T-W-O is a correct spelling, but might not be the right two that you're looking for. So make sure that you run the grammar and spell check, and then you have a dedicated tech writer or somebody who's got really good grammar skills and spelling skills take a look and review the documentation. So after that, you want to make sure after all of your descriptions, the implementations rather, are written, errors not covered by grammar and spell check, which I just mentioned, and make sure that the appropriate checkboxes are also checked off. You want to make sure that if something is corporate implemented or system specific, make sure that your checkboxes jive with what is being written in the implementation statement. And last but not least, make sure if you have a control, for example, AC2 is one that comes to mind. That has, I believe, A through K in there. You have got to answer A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and K, all of them, and make sure that they stand alone. They do sort of tell the story as you go through, but you want to make sure that each implementation, or I should say each implementation for the assessment objective, for each individual assessment objectives, those are A through K, that those stand alone and that each one of those assessment objectives tells the story rather, as it relates back to that individual assessment objective. Throughout the whole training up until this point, the 4 C's basically: clear, concise, consistent, and complete. So let's talk about clear writing. We want material that is unambiguous, that it is clear and it's comprehensive, that you say what you need to say using a solid amount of information, but nice, tight, and compact. We want to be able to understand what you're saying. Make sure it's written in a consistent and correct format, and that there's a logical presentation of the material. We want information to flow. We want to be able to see that story, not have things going out into a left field, right field, center field, all that. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about clear writing. Concise writing, let's talk about that for a second. So content and complexity are relevant to your audience. So you want to make sure you have the right content and that it's digestible, that it's not too complex, that they're able to understand what it is that they're reading. So to do that, you could almost take the perspective of leaving out superfluous words and phrases. Don't put in cliches, don't put in, BFF or anything like that. We want to make sure you just hit the point, you say what you need to say, and you move on. And also, omit words that don't really add any meaning, that they're just there for whatever. Get rid of those words. You don't need them. Make your point using concise writing. All right, let's talk about consistency. Consistency is a big thing because, remember, the documents are read by multiple people from top to bottom. So if chances are one person's seeing something that's inconsistent, the other person will see it too. It's just a matter of who's going to point it out first. So for consistent writing, we want terms that have the same meaning throughout the document. I mentioned this before with server names. That goes for acronyms and other terms relating to your systems. Make sure they have the same meaning throughout the document. Also, items that are referred to by the same name or description throughout the document. Again, consistency is key, because if you don't have a consistent name throughout the document, for example, it's going to be very hard to follow it through, wondering if it's the same thing or is it something different. And that leads to more time in the review, because the person looking at the document has to go back and see, for example, if you're mentioning hardware, is that the same piece that they're talking to, or is it something different? Then they have to go back and look in the hardware list. And so it's a lot of these little things that have a tendency to take up some time. So make sure your terms are complete throughout the entire document. The level of detail. This is a big one, because basically reiterating the control is not going to work. That's a good jumping off point, and a lot of times the CSPs I work with will ask me, well, can we repeat the control? Not necessarily. You can if you use it properly, though. If you say XYZ system conducts account reviews, that's all right, but then you need to go ahead and explain how and who and when and all the whole kit and caboodle. So don't do just the regurgitation of the control. That's going to get you nowhere fast. And the last thing we want to talk about, the completeness aspect of it. You've got to respond to all FedRAMP requirements. Make sure if you have A through D, you answer A, B, C, and D. We don't want any blanks. Blanks are not accepted. The package, I guarantee you, when it gets to that point, will be kicked right back. We will not accept any blanks in there. That goes for NAs. If you have something that's not applicable, you have to have a good reason why, and you have to state it in the implementation. So you also want to make sure the FedRAMP security package includes all of the appropriate sections of the FedRAMP template, cover to cover. Make sure you're inclusive of all that. And make sure you have attachments and appendices as well. Those are important, and those are read just as well. All right, so dovetailing nicely with the document acceptance criteria is the technical acceptance criteria. So let's start with readable. Readable refers to the 4 C's for text. You know those by now. Clear, concise, consistent, and complete. Is there a clear understanding of exactly what was written? That's the question you need to answer. The next one is relevant. Now, relevant refers to the control implementation addressing the specific requirements. So if the requirement rather asks you to establish and modify, did you establish and modify, and did you address it within the parameter constraints? So that's something you need to keep in mind as well. All right, let's talk about sufficiency. Sufficient refers to the level of detail and the thoroughness contained in the control implementation description. Do you have enough information in there to convey your point? It should be sufficient to allow a reader to understand what is done, who's doing it, and most importantly, how it is done. So, like I said before, a jumping off point would be to say XYZ does account reviews. Great. Now explain how you do them, how often. Make sure you are in check with the parameter constraints. Keep in mind of the assignments that are prescribed in the guidance when you read the control requirement. So that's sufficiency right there. Let's talk last but not least about complete. Now, complete refers to both the control implementation's description and its agreement with the marked control template boxes. Those are the boxes a little bit above where the implementation statement is typed in. You want to make sure that if you say something is system-specific, that you have a system-specific implementation. If it requires more than one answer, because it may be hybrid or it may be shared, you want to make sure that you have your system's implementation plus the portion of the implementation where the customer's piece would go, your customer's piece would go rather. So you would need to put in there a little blurb about what the expectation is from the customer. That's complete for you. All right, so now it's time to write the SSP. Let's talk about poor implementation descriptions, and then we'll talk about the good ones. All right, so poor implementation descriptions, they repeat or rephrase the control requirement instead of addressing the requirement. So, as I said before, you can use the line in to repeat. That's okay if you say XYZ system conducts account reviews monthly. That's fine. That won't get you in trouble. Leaving it there as the sole implementation, that's what's going to get you in trouble. What we need to see after that is the how, the who, the what, the when. All the details need to follow. So don't just repeat or rephrase something. If you choose to do that, and that's okay, you make sure that you have all of the heavy details after it. That's all right. Implementing boilerplate text. We don't want to see boilerplate text copied over and over and over throughout. It won't get read. You can't do that. It's just not going to answer the implementation no matter how many times you copy it over. So be very careful about boilerplate implementations. Text not directly relevant to describing how the control is implemented, that kind of goes back to making sure you're addressing the control. So be wary of what you're typing in there. And that's kind of how a tech writer will help. If you're writing it, having somebody else review it will kind of catch those mistakes if you're really intimately familiar with the system. If you leave an area in the SSP blank, again, that's going to come back right to you. They're not going to read it. It's not going to be reviewed. And then if you have to put something in there, for example, that's not applicable, that's okay, but you need to make sure it is marked NA with a risk-based justification. We need to know why it's not applicable, so you need to put a reason in there as to why it's not applicable. Poor control implementations also leave out, they don't describe all of the possible places where a control can be implemented. So if you have 2 data centers, we want to know about both data centers, of course, if it's applicable. So make sure that you describe all possible places where a control is implemented. So poor control descriptions also uh, address single controls that contain multiple requirements, but you don't address the multiple requirements. Again, we want to see everything answered in its entirety. Each A, B, C, and D must be clear, concise, consistent, and complete, and also adhere to the technical documentation standards. You also want to make sure the correct implementation status is checked. A lot of times, if you have in place, planned, and then it doesn't exactly say that in the implementation down below, that's a red flag and could potentially send the document back to you for a further review. Poor control implementations also leave out, they don't describe all of the possible places where a control can be implemented. So if you have two data centers, we want to know about both data centers, of course, if it's applicable. So make sure that you describe all possible places where a control is implemented. So poor control descriptions also address single controls that contain multiple requirements, but you don't address the multiple requirements. Again, we want to see everything answered in its entirety. Each A, B, C, and D must be clear, concise, consistent, and complete, and also adhere to the technical documentation standards. You also want to make sure the correct implementation status is checked. A lot of times, if you have in place, planned, and then it doesn't exactly say that in the implementation down below, that's a red flag and could potentially send the document back to you for a further review. All right, let's take a look at an example of readability. So here is AC 17 Part A. Read along with me. Asks for establishment and documentation of usage restrictions, configuration connection requirements, and implementation guidance for each type of remote access allowed. So here's a poor example of AC 17A. Remote access for privileged functions is permitted only for compelling operational needs, shall be strictly controlled, and must be approved in writing by whoever the role is. The number of users who can access the system name remotely is limited, and approval for such access is documented. Now, when the ISSOs and the JAB or the agency are reading this, these are the kinds of things that go through their mind, and why, or the rationale rather, as to why the example I just read is difficult to understand. So the text meanders all over the place around the point of what the control requires. It's off topic and it's non-specific. So that really makes it difficult for the reviewer, whoever it may be, to understand really what it is your CSP does to, or rather what your system does, I should say, to implement the control. It's also insufficient because it does not address all of the specific requirements of the control. All right, so that was just readability. Let's talk now about relevancy. Here's an example of relevancy for you. For CA1, the Security Assessment and Authorization Family, CA1 policies and procedures, the control requires that the policy is reviewed and updated every 3 years, and the procedures are reviewed and updated at least annually. So you have to remember, between NIST 853 Revision 3 and NIST 853 Revision 4, the -1 controls, the policy and procedure controls, their structures were manipulated a little bit. So let's take a look at why this CA1 Part B is a poor example. So certification, authorization, and security assessment procedures address all areas in the policy and policy-compliant implementations of related security controls. Well, this example simply isn't relevant because it does not address the specifics of CA1 Part B. So now a better example might be this. XYZ system certification, authorization, and security assessment policies are reviewed and updated by XYZ role at least every 3 years using XYZ process. The associated procedures are reviewed and updated by the roles, whatever they are, at least annually using whatever process. So you want to make sure that you're covering everything that we've talked about up to this point. The who, the what, and most importantly, the how. You can use this as a guide to help you craft and really derive a very strong implementation statement. This hits the nail on the head. Obviously, with the specifics, it would be a lot more easier to digest, but we gave you here an example to help you show exactly what we're looking for. If it says what we just talked about a second ago, you really shouldn't have a problem writing implementation statements for the dash one controls, the policies and procedures, and really everything that follows thereafter. Time to talk sufficiency. Let's take a look at a sufficiency example that's not up to snuff. Take CP9, Part C. The requirements include the backup of system documentation. Now, the backup meaning daily, incremental, weekly, full, and at least 3 backup copies. So here's an example of a poor implementation. The XYZ system has a data backup procedure in accordance with control requirements. Daily, incremental, and weekly full backups are performed. This tells me absolutely nothing about the backups that are performed. It doesn't tell me who does them, doesn't tell me when they're done, doesn't tell me how they're done. And saying daily and weekly are okay, but you need to be a little bit more specific than that. So, how do you make that poor implementation a good implementation? So, the reason, like I said, is that it's insufficient because it doesn't specifically mention backup of system documentation, and it doesn't address the requirement for at least 3 backup copies at all. So you want to make sure, again, as we've been saying throughout this training, each implementation and the assessment objective, so in this case it would be Part C, has to stand alone and it has to tell its own story. So make sure you read the elements that are required, and also if there are organization-defined requirements and additional FedRAMP guidance. All of that needs to be included. Now, additional FedRAMP guidance sometimes has its own place for implementations, so make sure that one way or another, everything gets included. How do you make that poor implementation a good implementation? So the reason, like I said, is that it's insufficient because it doesn't specifically mention backup of system documentation, and it doesn't address the requirement for at least 3 backup copies at all. So you want to make sure, again, as we've been saying throughout this training, each implementation and the assessment objective, so in this case it would be Part C, has to stand alone and it has to tell its own story. So make sure you read the elements that are required, and also if there are organization-defined requirements and additional FedRAMP guidance. All of that needs to be included. Now, additional FedRAMP guidance sometimes has its own place for implementations, so make sure that one way or another, everything gets included. All right, so we just talked about what makes a poor implementation. Let's talk about the other side of the coin and a strong implementation. So in analyzing a proper response to a control, we're going to take a look at the access control, or AC family. One of the easiest controls to do this with is AC2. It addresses account management. It is your responsibility to describe the information security control as it is implemented on your system. All controls originate from a system or from a business process. It's important to describe where the control originates from so that it is clear whose responsibility it is to implement, manage, and monitor the control. In some cases, the responsibility is shared by a CSP and by its customer. Now, with regard to account management specifically, information system account types include, for example, individual, shared, group, system, temporary, and service accounts. The identification of authorized users of the information system and the specification of access privileges reflects the requirements in other security controls in the SSP. Now, users requiring administrative privileges on information system accounts receive additional scrutiny by appropriate organization personnel. For example, a system owner, a mission or business owner, or a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, who's really responsible for approving such accounts and privileged access. Now, organizations may choose from time to time to define access privileges, or other attributes by account, by type of account, or a combination of both. It depends. Other attributes required for authorizing access include restrictions on time of day of week, and point of origin. Now, in defining other account attributes, organizations consider system-related requirements, for example, scheduled maintenance and system upgrades, and mission or business requirements, that's time zone differences, customer requirements, and remote access to support travel requirements. Now, failure to consider these factors could affect your information systems availability. So what we want to do is take a look further at. So we've been talking throughout this training video about telling your story. So we're going to help you do that in case, it may be causing you some heartache. So we're going to break down AC2 to its basic form. First, each control objective, that's A through K, will need to be answered individually. Remember, it's got to tell its own story. Each objective, that is, has to tell its own story and be answered individually and stand on its own. So, as a guide to understanding the requirements for each control, NIST SP 853 Rev 4 test cases may be reviewed. You may want to take a look at those. The test case workbook provides a standard risk and controls template for assessing baseline controls, and it also helps to drive consistency in the annual assessment testing performed by your 3PAO, whoever that may be. Now, keep in mind, 3PAOs use this workbook to test the selected baseline controls per the required test procedures, and they document any control deficiencies and findings they have during testing. So use the control as a cascading point to the rest of the definition. For example here, the organization ... assigns account managers for information system accounts. The organization establishes conditions for group role and membership. Look at the verb. The verbs are key. Those are, of course, in grammar, those are action words. So look at the verb in the control requirement. Assigns is the verb in each control, and it explains the action to be implemented and must be used in the description. So here's where the storytelling part comes in. The who, that's from your types of user list, assigns the account managers. Who does that? How and when are account managers assigned? Tell us how this is done. If there's a process, tell us how it's done. What is it? Who is informed? When? How are they informed? What records are kept? You want to get in a process of asking yourself questions that you think readers of the SSP would be interested in knowing. Walk the reader through it like writing a story. Have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So keep in mind, a 3PAO must be able to test the control and examine the evidence provided by the CSP. So you're going to want to make sure that when you explain what it is or how it is that you're implementing the control, think about, while you're writing that, the evidence that could support what you're saying. So how many times have you gone through the FedRAMP requirements and said to yourself, what is an organization-defined assignment? Well, we're going to help you out with that, and we're going to use AC2A as an example. So in this case, the control is asking to identify and select the following types of information system accounts to support organizational mission business functions. So the definition and the assignment may come from standard operating procedures, policy documents, or a ConOps guide. From the requirement, the control is asking you to identify and select the following types of information system accounts to support organizational and mission business functions. So these are essentially the accounts that relate, your accounts that relate to the system. Now the CSP, you basically, can choose to include a reference to policies where these accounts are identified, as long as the reference includes, as I've been saying throughout this training, the name, the date, the version of the policies, and the section number where these accounts can be located in those documents. The assignments are also documented in the parameter sections of the control summary information following the requirements. Now, when multiple requirements are presented, as in the case with AC2 Objective F, each action needs to be individually addressed. Remember, this has to stand on its own, so it's got to be individually addressed with the same level of detail to satisfy the control, so eventually it is testable. Now, make sure that you write to the how and the why for how your organization creates system accounts, enables system accounts, modify system accounts, disable system accounts, and remove system accounts. Now, I just want to say, if there are other accounts, you need to address those as well. Well, that about wraps up the training, but before we go, we want to give you some information you can take with you to help you out while you get your documentation together. First, fedramp.gov. That is the place for all of the documents and templates. Always check fedramp.gov. We also put out some tips and cues that are written by our entire team to help give you tricks of the trade and what we look for. So check out our tips and cues list. That's always very helpful. Check out our newsletter. We keep you up to date with all things FedRAMP going on all the time. And lastly, if you need more training materials or if you want to go back and look at one of our other training sessions, again, fedramp.gov is the place to go. Also, if you need control guidance, NIST 853 Revision 4 is of course helpful. You can check there for supplemental guidance, and that'll help you actually enhance your understanding of the control. So with that said, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@fedramp.gov. I'm Jason Oxenhandler. We will see you next time.